The 1990s were weird for technology, like genuinely weird. Companies were throwing everything at the wall to see what stuck. Virtual reality headsets that made you sick, handheld game consoles that nobody asked for, personal digital assistants that couldn't recognize your handwriting. And some of these gadgets, they should have been hits. They had massive companies behind them, huge marketing budgets, cutting-edge technology. They should have changed the world. Instead, they failed. Spectacularly. And the people who created them? Some of them lost their jobs, others lost their companies. And one guy's failure was so public, so humiliating that he left the company he helped build and died shortly after in a car accident that people still whisper about. So tonight, I'm going to tell you about 5 gadgets from the 90s that everyone's forgotten. Not because they were boring, because their failures were so catastrophic that nobody wants to remember them. These stories get dark. Let's get into it. 1993. Apple releases the Newton Message Pad, and it's supposed to be revolutionary. This is the world's first personal digital assistant, a handheld computer that can organize your life, take notes, send faxes, and here's the big feature. It can recognize your handwriting. You write on the screen with a stylus, and the Newton converts it to digital text. In 1993, that's insane. That's sci-fi technology. Apple's marketing is calling it the device that will change how we work. John Sculley, the CEO of Apple at the time, he's all in on the Newton. He's been developing it for years, spending hundreds of millions of dollars. This is his baby, his vision for Apple's future. And when it launches, the hype is massive. People are lining up to buy it. Tech magazines are calling it the future of computing. Apple's stock goes up. Everything looks perfect. Except there was one tiny problem. The handwriting recognition didn't work, like at all. You'd write something simple like lunch meeting at noon, and the Newton would read it as punch ceiling at moo, or some nonsense. It was hilariously bad, and this wasn't just a minor bug, this was the feature. The entire point of the Newton was that you could write naturally, and it would understand you. But it didn't. It was so bad that Gary Trudeau's Doonesbury comic strip ran an entire week making fun of it. The Newton became a punchline. Sales were terrible. Apple had projected they'd sell millions. They sold about 50,000 in the first year. That's a disaster. The Newton was bleeding money, hundreds of millions in development costs, and it was just flopping. John Sculley's reputation was destroyed. The board forced him out in 1993. The guy who had run Apple for a decade, who had kicked out Steve Jobs, was now being kicked out himself. And the Newton? It became his legacy of failure. 1997, Steve Jobs returns to Apple, and one of the first things he does, he walks into a meeting about the Newton and says, "Kill it." The Newton team tried to defend it. They'd been working on it for years. They'd fixed a lot of the handwriting problems. Newer versions were actually pretty good, but Jobs didn't care. He looked at the Newton and saw John Sculley, the man who had kicked him out of Apple in 1985. The Newton was Sculley's baby, and Jobs wanted it dead. This wasn't about business. This was personal. February 27th, 1998. Apple officially discontinues the Newton. Every product line, every model, just cancelled. And here's the dark part. The entire Newton division got fired. Over 200 people lost their jobs overnight. These were engineers who had dedicated years of their lives to this product. Some of them had turned down jobs at Microsoft, at IBM, because they believed in the Newton. And then one day, Steve Jobs walks back into Apple and erases everything they built. Here's what makes this story even darker. The Newton actually pioneered a lot of ideas that worked later. The concept of a touchscreen PDA. That became the Palm Pilot, which was hugely successful. The idea of a tablet with handwriting recognition. That became the iPad. Steve Jobs killed the Newton. And then 10 years later, he released the iPhone and iPad using basically the same concepts. He just waited until the technology was ready. But by then, the Newton team was gone, scattered to other companies. They never got credit for being ahead of their time. All they got was being part of one of Apple's biggest failures. John Sculley tried to start other companies, but he was damaged goods. Nobody wanted to hire the guy who got kicked out of Apple twice, once by the board, once by Steve Jobs' ghost. The Newton went from being the future of computing to a punchline to completely forgotten, and the people who built it, they just got erased. Before we talk about the Virtual Boy, you need to know about Gunpei Yokoi. This guy was a legend at Nintendo. He designed the Game & Watch. He designed the Game Boy, which became the best-selling handheld console of all time. He created the D-pad that's still on every controller today. Gunpei Yokoi was one of Nintendo's most important people. Shigeru Miyamoto, the guy who made Mario, he called Yokoi his mentor. Everyone at Nintendo respected him. So in the early 90s, when Yokoi said he wanted to make a 3D gaming console, Nintendo gave him the resources. They trusted him. He'd never failed before. 1995, Nintendo releases the Virtual Boy, and from day one, everyone can see it's a disaster. First, it's not portable. You can't hold it. You have to put it on a table and stick your face into it like you're looking through binoculars. So it's not portable like the Game Boy, but it's also not powerful like home consoles. It's stuck in this weird middle ground. Second, the 3D only works in red and black, not full color, just red. Everything is red, because the LED technology was cheaper, and Nintendo was trying to keep costs down. But playing a game that's entirely red for more than 10 minutes gives you a headache. Like, a serious headache. Some people got nauseous. Third, the games were terrible. There were only 14 games ever released for it in America. 14. And most of them were just ports of existing games with 3D added, which didn't make them better. It made them harder to play and painful to look at. Nintendo marketed it as virtual reality, but it wasn't VR. It was just stereoscopic 3D, which had existed for decades. It was a gimmick with no substance. The Virtual Boy launched for $180. Nintendo predicted they'd sell 3 million units in the first year. They sold 770,000 worldwide in its entire lifespan. Reviews were brutal. GamePro called it Nintendo's worst product ever. The New York Times said it was the 3D virtual flop. Parents were complaining that it gave their kids headaches. Stores couldn't give them away. They were marking them down to $50, $30, just to clear inventory. And this wasn't some small project. This was a major Nintendo console launch. They'd spent millions on development, millions on marketing, and it was bombing spectacularly. Within a year, Nintendo quietly discontinued it. They stopped making games, stopped making consoles, just killed it. In Japan, they didn't even last that long. They killed it after a few months. Now here's where it gets really dark. The Virtual Boy's failure was blamed entirely on Gunpei Yokoi, not on Nintendo's executives who approved it, not on the marketing team, not on the fact that the technology wasn't ready, just Yokoi. The man who created the Game Boy, which made Nintendo billions, was being treated like a failure because of one bad product. In 1996, Yokoi resigned from Nintendo, but everyone knew what that meant. He was pushed out. After 30 years at the company, after designing some of their most important products, he was forced to leave because of the Virtual Boy. He tried to start his own company, Koto Laboratory. He started designing a new handheld console called the Wonder Swan. He was trying to rebuild his reputation, prove he still had it. October 4th, 1997. Gunpei Yokoi is driving on the Hokuriku Expressway in Japan. He gets in a minor traffic accident. Just a small fender bender, nothing serious. He pulls over to the side of the highway to check the damage, and then, while he's standing next to his car, another car hits him, kills him instantly. He was 56 years old. The official report said it was an accident. The driver of the other car said he didn't see him, but people at Nintendo, people in the Japanese game industry, they whispered about it. Some thought he was distracted, depressed about being forced out of Nintendo. Others wondered if it was really an accident at all. We'll never know. What we do know is that one of the most important figures in gaming history died just a year after being pushed out of the company he helped build. And the reason he was pushed out? The Virtual Boy. A product that Nintendo executives approved, that Nintendo marketing sold, that Nintendo released too early. Gunpei Yokoi created the Game Boy, one of the most successful products in gaming history. But his legacy became the Virtual Boy, one of the biggest failures. And then he died before he could prove himself again. The Virtual Boy isn't just a failed gadget. It's the product that destroyed a legend's reputation and maybe even cost him his life. That's not just dark, that's tragic. Early 1990s. Sony has a problem. CDs are taking over from cassette tapes, but CDs can't record. You can't make mixtapes on CDs. You can't record from the radio. CDs are read-only. So Sony creates something new, the MiniDisc. It's brilliant, honestly. It's smaller than a CD, but it can record and re-record hundreds of times. It's digital quality. It's shock-resistant, so it won't skip when you're moving. You can edit tracks, rearrange them, name them. It's everything a cassette can do, but digital. From a technical standpoint, MiniDisc is superior to CDs in almost every way. Sony spent hundreds of millions developing it. They launched it in 1992 with a massive marketing campaign. They were convinced this was the future of music. But there were problems. Big problems. First, MiniDisc players were expensive. Like, really expensive. A decent portable MiniDisc player cost $300 to $400. You could buy a CD player for $50. Yeah, the MiniDisc could record, but was that worth paying 6 times more? Second, blank MiniDiscs were expensive too. A blank MiniDisc cost like $5 to $7 each. Blank cassette tapes cost 50 cents. So even if you bought the player, you were paying a premium forever. Third, and this is the big one, the music industry didn't support it. Record labels weren't releasing albums on MiniDisc. So if you wanted to listen to music on MiniDisc, you had to buy the CD first, then record it onto MiniDisc. Why would anyone do that? You already have the CD. Sony tried to get other companies to adopt MiniDisc as a format. They failed. It was a Sony-only thing, which meant it was never going to become the standard. Late 1990s, MP3 players start appearing, and suddenly, MiniDisc looks ancient. MP3 players don't need discs. You just copy files from your computer. No physical media, and storage keeps getting bigger and cheaper. First, you can carry 10 songs, then 100, then 1,000. 1998. Diamond Rio releases the first mainstream MP3 player. It holds 32 megabytes, about an hour of music. Not much, but it's a start. 2001. Apple releases the iPod. 5 gigabytes, 1,000 songs. And it's slick, it's beautiful, it's easy to use. The iPod doesn't just compete with MiniDisc, it makes MiniDisc look stupid. Why would you carry around physical discs when you can have your entire music library in your pocket? Sony knew MP3s were coming. They could have pivoted. They could have started making MP3 players. But they were so invested in MiniDisc, billions of dollars, over a decade of development, they couldn't let it go. They kept releasing new MiniDisc players through the 2000s, but nobody was buying them. The format was dead. They just wouldn't admit it. 2013. Sony finally, officially discontinues MiniDisc. 21 years after launching it. 21 years of losses. Sony never released official numbers, but analysts estimate they lost somewhere between $2 and $3 billion on MiniDisc. Development costs, manufacturing, marketing, all for a format that never caught on outside of Japan. And here's the really painful part. While Sony was pouring money into MiniDisc, Apple was building the iPod and creating the iTunes Store. Sony could have been Apple. They had the technology, they had the music label relationships, they owned a record label for God's sake. They should have dominated digital music, but they were too committed to MiniDisc. They couldn't let go of their sunk costs. And by the time they finally admitted defeat, Apple had won. The iPod owned the market. MiniDisc was superior technology that lost to inferior technology because Sony couldn't read the market. That's not just a failure, that's a tragedy of stubbornness. MiniDisc is the perfect example of how being first doesn't matter if you're too expensive and too stubborn to adapt. Alright, 2 more stories. We've got the handheld console that tried to compete with Game Boy and failed miserably, and the most expensive gaming console ever made that bankrupted its creator. These last 2 are brutal. Mid-1990s. Sega is actually competing with Nintendo. The Sega Genesis is selling well, Sonic the Hedgehog is iconic, Sega has momentum. They're not winning, but they're competitive. And Sega decides they want to get into portable gaming. Game Boy is dominating that market, so Sega wants a piece of it. Their first attempt, the Game Gear, did okay. Not great, but okay. So in 1995, Sega releases the Nomad, and on paper, it's incredible. It's a portable console that plays full Genesis games, not watered-down versions, actual Genesis cartridges, the same games you play at home, now portable. This is way more powerful than the Game Boy. The Game Boy is 8-bit. The Nomad is 16-bit. The graphics are better. The sound is better. The games are better. Technically, the Nomad is superior in every way. But the Nomad had some issues. First, the battery life was a joke. It used 6 AA batteries and lasted about 2 to 3 hours. The Game Boy lasted 10 to 15 hours on 4 AAS, so you'd be playing Sonic on the Nomad, and the batteries would die before you finished 2 levels. Second, it was huge and heavy. The Game Boy was small and light. You could fit it in your pocket. The Nomad was like carrying a brick. It didn't fit in pockets. It wasn't comfortable to hold for long periods. Third, and this is the big one, the screen was tiny for Genesis games. Genesis games were designed for TVs. They had small text, detailed backgrounds. On the Nomad's 3.2 5-inch screen, you couldn't see anything. Some games were literally unplayable because the text was too small to read. Fourth, it was expensive. $180 at launch. The Game Boy was $70. You could buy a Game Boy and like 10 games for the price of a Nomad. The Nomad launched in October 1995. Sega predicted strong sales going into the holidays. They thought this would be their Game Boy killer. They sold about 1 million units, total. Over its entire lifespan, the Game Boy was selling 10 to 15 million per year. And here's why it failed. By 1995, the Genesis was already old. The PlayStation and Nintendo 64 were coming. The 16-bit era was ending. So even if the Nomad worked perfectly, it was playing games from a dying console generation. Sega released a portable console for the Genesis. Right as everyone was moving on from the Genesis, the timing couldn't have been worse. By 1999, Sega quietly discontinued the Nomad. No announcement, no ceremony. It just disappeared from stores. The Nomad wasn't the only reason Sega collapsed, but it was part of a pattern. Sega kept releasing hardware nobody asked for. The 32X, the Sega CD, the Nomad, the Saturn. All of these were expensive failures that bled money. By the late 90s, Sega was in serious trouble. They'd spent billions on failed hardware. Developers were leaving. Third-party support was gone. 2001, Sega releases the Dreamcast. Actually, a really good console. But it's too late. They're too damaged. The Dreamcast fails, and Sega exits the console business entirely. Sega went from competing with Nintendo to not making consoles at all in about 6 years. And the Nomad was one of the products that got them there. A portable console nobody wanted, released at the worst possible time. The people who worked on the Nomad, a lot of them lost their jobs when Sega started the massive layoffs in the late 90s. The Nomad was supposed to save Sega's portable gaming division. Instead, it was one more nail in the coffin. 1991, Trip Hawkins, the founder of Electronic Arts, one of the biggest gaming companies in the world. He leaves EA to start a new company. And his plan is ambitious. Create the most powerful gaming console ever made. He calls it the 3DO, and he gets everyone excited about it. He signs deals with Panasonic, Sanyo, Gold Star. Multiple manufacturers will make 3DO consoles. He gets software developers on board. Time Warner invests. AT&T invests. He raises over $70 million. The pitch is that 3DO will be the standard, not a Nintendo or Sega, an open platform that any company can make hardware for, like how any company can make PCs. That's revolutionary for gaming. And the technology is genuinely impressive. 32-bit processor when everything else is 16-bit. CD-ROM storage, full motion video. The 3DO is more powerful than the PlayStation, which won't come out for another 2 years. Trip Hawkins is convinced the 3DO will be the future of gaming. He's staking his entire reputation on it. October 1993, the 3DO launches, and the price is $699. At the same time, the Super Nintendo costs $199. The Sega Genesis costs $149. The 3DO costs more than both of them combined. Hawkins' logic was that this is premium technology, so it should cost premium prices. He compared it to buying high-end stereo equipment, but gamers aren't audiophiles. They're kids, teenagers, people who don't have $700 to spend on a video game console, and it gets worse. The games cost $60 to $80 each, so you're spending $700 on the console and then $80 per game. You could buy a Super Nintendo and 10 games for less than the cost of a 3DO with 2 games. Reviews were positive about the technology. Magazines said the graphics were impressive, the audio was great. But every review ended with, "But it's too expensive. Don't buy this unless you're rich." The 3DO sold about 750,000 units in its first year. That sounds okay until you realize they needed to sell millions to break even. The manufacturing costs were so high that they were losing money on every console sold, hoping to make it back on game sales. But without a huge user base, developers weren't making games for it. By 1994, it was clear the 3DO was failing. The PlayStation was coming, the Saturn was coming, and they were both going to cost $300 to $400. Still expensive, but not $700 insane. Trip Hawkins started panicking. They dropped the price to $399, then to $299. But it didn't matter. The reputation was set. The 3DO was the console for rich people, and nobody wanted to be seen as the person who wasted money on it. 1995. Sony releases the PlayStation for $299. It's more powerful than the 3DO, has way more games, and costs less. The 3DO is dead in the water. 1996. The 3DO company officially discontinues the console. Total sales: about 2 million units worldwide. Total losses: over $500 million. Trip Hawkins went from being the founder of EA, one of gaming's success stories, to the guy who made the biggest flop in console history. The 3DO company tried to pivot. They started making games instead of hardware. They released some okay games, but the company was toxic. Nobody wanted to work with them. Investors were done. 2003. The 3DO company filed for bankruptcy. Completely dead. All the investors lost their money. All the employees lost their jobs. And Trip Hawkins? His reputation never recovered. He tried to start other companies. He made some mobile games in the mid-2000s, but nobody took him seriously. He was the 3DO guy, the man who thought gamers would pay $700 for a console. In interviews later, Hawkins admitted the pricing was a mistake, but he also blamed the manufacturers, the timing, the market. He never fully took responsibility, and that made it worse. If you can't admit what you did wrong, you can't rebuild. The 3DO is remembered as one of the most expensive mistakes in gaming history, and Trip Hawkins, who should be remembered as the founder of EA, is instead remembered for losing $500 million on a console nobody wanted. So there you have it. 5 forgotten gadgets from the 90s. The Apple Newton, killed by Steve Jobs' revenge. The team erased from history. The Nintendo Virtual Boy, the failure that destroyed Gunpei Yokoi and maybe cost him his life. The Sony MiniDisc, superior technology that lost because Sony was too stubborn to let go. The Sega Nomad, a portable console for a dying platform that helped kill Sega's hardware business. And the 3DO, the $700 console that bankrupted its creator and destroyed his reputation. And here's what connects all these stories. They were all made by smart people. These weren't idiots. These were experienced engineers, successful executives, people who had built successful products before. But they all made the same mistake. They fell in love with their own ideas. They stopped listening to the market. They ignored the warning signs. And they paid for it. The Newton team ignored that the handwriting recognition didn't work. Gunpei Yokoi rushed the Virtual Boy to market even though it gave people headaches. Sony kept pushing MiniDisc even as MP3s took over. Sega released the Nomad, right as 16-bit was dying. Trip Hawkins thought gamers would pay $700. They all believed so strongly in their vision that they couldn't see reality. And that's how you fail. If you want more stories about forgotten tech, gadget disasters, and the dark side of innovation, subscribe to the channel. I've got plenty more of these stories. And let me know in the comments. Did you own any of these? A Newton? A Virtual Boy? Did your parents blow $700 on a 3DO? I'd love to hear your stories. All right, see you in the next one.